I would like to start this video by thanking Richard from the Crossbow Nation Forum. His ingenuity and creative mind led to a trigger upgrade that greatly improves the Centerpoint sniper and specialist crossbow. My intent of this video is to give others the confidence to do their own trigger upgrade. I admit this is my first tutorial video ever. It's far from perfect. I do feel that it should be used more as a guide and confidence booster for you do-it-yourselfers. I do strongly recommend following Richard's written directions to a T. My video should only be used as a confidence booster to those still on the fence about doing their own trigger job. I have 2 lessons learned from this project. One was make sure the L bracket in step 11 is centered exactly, because when you place the block back into the crossbow rail, it won't fit if it's not centered. I had to grind mine down a little bit to get it to fit. So remember, this is one key point. The next key point is adjusting the black set screw to squeeze the trigger in step 16. I had an issue with this step. I had to tear my Centerpoint crossbow back apart a couple times because the safety and dry fire mechanism weren't working correctly. My set screw was tightened down a little tighter than it should have been. So I found by doing a 3/4 turn out instead of the 1/3 turn, I got a perfect trigger. Please enjoy this video, and I truly appreciate doing these things because others also do these videos on YouTube, and hopefully I'm helping to give back to the community. Enjoy. So first thing, what you're going to see is George taking off the sling. We have found that by taking off the sling, it's just easier to work on the Sniper 370 and the Specialist 370. Or Specialist, whatever the Specialist is. So what we have here is I took the instructions and then we just labeled a piece of cardboard here so we can lay the parts down and remember how they go when we start putting the Specialist and Sniper back together. I am going to be referring to these instructions along the way. The first step is secure the sniper in the bench vise. We have found that we're just doing this with a towel on the workbench. It seems to be working just as fine. The next step is remove the Centerpoint scope and place it somewhere safe. The 2 side mount screws loosen from the Picatinny rail. Step number 3 is loosen off the anti-dry fire switch. And what George is doing here is just kind of getting the screwdriver under it and slightly pressing it off, being very careful. It slides off very easily. Do not force this. This step is actually very simple. Number 4 is remove the Allen screws at the top of the Picatinny rail. And you'll notice that there is 2 Allen screws at the top of the Picatinny rail. Do not touch these screws. These Phillips heads, these are not the ones you want to touch. Just the Allen screws. What George is removing now is the rear Phillips head screw. This one comes out rather difficult, so make sure you push down very hard so you do not strip the head. This is the Picatinny rail removed. Simply put this aside on your cardboard. Step 5 is removing the pistol grip. What you want to do is remove this end cover first. Then inside the pistol grip is another Phillips head screw. Remove that. Make sure you push down very hard on the inside screw because it comes out rather difficult. Be very careful not to strip this. It is rather difficult to see, but there is a screw on the inside of this grip. Make sure you loosen this too. Step number 6 is remove the camo trigger surround. There's 3 Allen screws at the bottom. 1, 2 in the middle here, and then 1 on the end. So remove the camo trigger surround.
That's not the right one. It's too loose.
Okay, what George is going to do here, this is very, very snug. So you need to push down like George is doing here, and he's, there. He actually removed it before this, but it was hard just to push off on the front. That piece comes off. Now, this is what you're looking at. Please note, this is what's there. Also note, this opening here on the end of the barrel. This is extremely important as we drill and tap the die later in this process. The square block that was in the trigger kit needs to fit in that groove. So it's very important that we center this. Notice how the parts are going onto our cardboard. Now, George is removing the 4 screws that hold the trigger assembly into the crossbow. These come out rather difficult. So make sure you get the right size screwdriver and push pretty hard on it when you're trying to unscrew them. They're very difficult. Taking some strength. There we go. Now it breaks loose. Just to be clear, there's 2 more screws on the back side for a total of 4 to remove this assembly. Put these in a safe location. When setting this down, just be extremely careful that you do not damage the trigger mechanism here. So it was also very helpful to have another person in the garage. It's also important not to have a wimp in the garage. I can probably help George on this. These are extremely tight. We had to push down with a lot of pressure. I actually take back what I said about George. These were on there pretty darn good. Be very careful.
Are you ready?
Now, you'll notice George has a punch in his hand, or I don't even know what it's called, but it's like a... It's a punch, he says. And what he's doing is pushing out the pin. Mine came out a little bit more rugged. That's a silver pin. It simply just slides out with the help of the punch. You may need to tap it slightly, but do not force it. It moves very easily. Now, you'll notice George slips the back of the trigger mechanism box up. As he slips it up, then he's going to lift up on the front, if I remember right, and it'll extend the trigger mechanism down. Do not force anything.
Hard though.
So George just pulled this up, and what you'll see is he's going to kind of slightly push it ahead, forward, and then which will extend this handle down here so we can remove the trigger off here. This is a little bit of finagling. So what you'll notice is, see how the trigger hangs out of the bottom? This piece is kind of like slid at an angle like this, which exposes this piece. We just need to slide this C-ring off, or C thing off, and the pin should slide right out of there. So now what you have is, notice this is hanging out, and what George has now in his hand is he pulled the C-clip off there and then slid the pin out very easily. There's no reason to force anything here. Now George is going to simply remove the trigger mechanism, and we're going to bring over to the drill press. Just to give a quick view of this trigger mechanism, I'll just kind of show you it. Actually more simple than I ever imagined it would be. This is exactly where we're going to put the block onto, on the back here, making sure it's centered. The key point is centered on this block so it will fit into the rail of the crossbow, which we're going to make sure we show again at this video. Key point, very important. We're actually going to have to take this pin out, which will pull the trigger mechanism out, and then we're going to apply the new spring. And then George, can you open that up to show people what that looks like? This is going to be our new, this is our old pin. We're going to put our new one with a new lightweight spring in there. There we are. That's the old one. Here's all the new components, which we're going to install in just a matter of minutes. This part actually goes pretty smoothly. George is using his calipers to measure this. However, if you don't have these fancy tools, I recommend using a ruler. But you want to make sure that it's dead center of this block and flush with the back of the block. I didn't realize this step when I did my sniper, and I had to do a little bit of filing. What George is doing is just scribing a line dead center. We want to make sure this is dead center because, like I said, it needs to line up with the rail of the crossbow. This is something that you have to pay very good attention to. Lined up. He has it perfectly centered on the trigger block, and now I'm going to run the hammer down and punch a hole in here so our drill has a good pilot hole. As you can see, I just barely pounded down with a punch and put a nice little hole here. This is going to help the pilot drill, which we're going to use a smaller drill to drill the 5 and then drill a 5/32 hole. Correct, George? Mm-hmm. We may act a little anal retentive about this process. However, the problem I ran into was when I put it back into the receiver, I was slightly off center and it caught on inside the rail. So just George is double checking. That set us back a couple beers. Right now you'll see George putting this into the vise on the drill press. As Richard mentioned on the site, if you're really steady, you could probably drill this by hand, but we're really not. We've had a long day today, so we're going to use a drill press. We're going to put our pilot drill in.
You got to turn that light off.
What we're going to do is center this drill on the block and the hole that we tap. George is on the anal retentive side, but I don't blame him. He's very particular. What we're going to do is start drilling our pilot hole here. You'll notice some tape on the drill bit. This is to measure down approximately 3/4 of an inch. The reason we have 3/4 of an inch is the bolt that goes down into this hole is rather long, and also the tap and die set, the tap has a taper on the end, so we need to make sure we have enough room. So please drill approximately 3/4 of an inch. Notice we're just drilling slow. We're in no hurry. I want it to come out nice. So we're just taking our time. Now, you're gonna see our pilot hole has been drilled. Next up is putting in the 5/32 drill, or number 21. Now we have the 5/32 drill in here. We're gonna also drill 3/4 of an inch with this drill bit, drilling slowly, making sure that we're very precision. Now, George has just finished drilling that hole. What we're gonna do is leave the trigger mechanism in the vise now, and George is going to start tapping the hole in the drill press. Keep in mind, we're not going to turn on the drill press. We're simply just chucking it by hand. This is just to keep the preciseness. Remember, George at one time was a machinist. Ever since his career change, this has brought back bad memories, I imagine. So what you'll notice is George is chucking the drill by hand, actually the tap by hand. And he's just slowly getting the threads in the hole, the 5/32 threads, Keep in mind, not rushing, and then he's going to turn it inwards and then back out to hopefully get all the shrapnel that's in the hole out of there. So keep in mind, he's just taking his time, and he'll try to work the tap down about 3/4 of an inch. Notice in and out. We're not rushing this. He's cleaning the threads right now by going opposite. What this does is allows all the metal filings that are in that hole to come out. Now, George is going to do the rest by hand. He's got it started precisely from the drill bit press. Notice how George is now tapping the hole by hand. He originally started it from the drill press, and all it did is just make it that much easier to tap. For all those watching this YouTube video, tonight is about -15 degrees out here in Vermont. So what better thing can you do than spend time with your buddy and do a trigger job on your specialist or sniper? Notice that George is going to use the air compressor and blow out any metal filing. This is very important. So now, what you're going to see is the new spring and pin that's going to go into the hole before we install the piece over it. So we placed the pin under there with a new spring, and now George is placing the rocker, that's what I'm going to call it, but I don't think that's the name. He's going to slide the pin back through before we put the trigger block on top. Okay. This bolt threads in rather hard because there's stuff on the thread, but that's normal. Just make sure you do not strip the thread and take your time.
It's back.
Notice that George is tightening this down. So what I did here is I just adjusted down or tightened down the bolt and this, like we'll say, L bracket, and I just snugged it up. Be careful, do not strip it. You don't want to go too tight with this. So the next step is we're on to step 13, and we just barely completed step 12. To all those watching, notice how it's nice and centered on the block. If it isn't, those lips inside this main rail will cause issues. It did for me. That's why I'm stressing this. Please pay attention and make sure that it's dead center, because these lips in the rail, I'm zooming in nice and close so you can see those lips. Why it's important it's centered on this block. We just tested this. We're going to take it out now and adjust it. But we wanted to make sure that it fit correctly in this rail. Next is adjustment of this black set screw. You'll notice that there's a fair amount of space right now. We want to make sure that we tighten this down. We're going to follow the instructions. So the instructions are adjusted the Allen screw so it is just touching the rocker. This Allen screw has a compound on it that keeps it from loosening, so it may be initially tight. With the trigger lock in the safe position, I adjusted the Allen screw a 1/4 turn at a time and tested the locking mechanism. At some point, the pressure of the Allen screw on the sear pin will bottom it out and keep the safety from freely moving. At that point, I backed out the Allen 1/3 turn and retested the safety to make sure it moves forward and aft. Do this several times. As a word of warning to people, I tighten this down a little too tight. So what we're finding is, turn it down as the directions say, but it may be a little bit more than 1/3. But like I said, is follow the directions. So right now it's on safety, and you notice there's still a little bit of play. George is going to tighten this down so it's snug. Then we're going to come off. The directions say 1/3 of the turn. However, I felt like it might have been a little bit more. Notice he's pushing down and there's still a little bit of play. Now we've adjusted that set screw. We came off 3/4 of a turn from when it was cranked down in safety mode. Now you're going to notice George is going to want to make it so the bottom bracket falls out. So he actually wants to tilt it up a little bit further. This is just a little bit of working it around. Notice you're going to see George tipping it up on the front like this. And then it's going to drop this down below. That is nice. Now it's just a matter of putting the trigger on there and sliding the pin through and putting the C-clip on. But notice how it has that tilt up, and that's how it goes.
Remember, this one came on harder, Phil.
Yeah, this one's going to go on harder, the C-clip. So what you'll see is we just slid the silver pin back in after we put the C-clip on. Next is to tighten the 4 bolts. 2 on this side and 2 on the other. George is just checking to make sure that these are just nice and snug. Next is going to be the stock piece. This is going to go back on. Be careful not to damage your trigger. You just want to make sure that it fits. And this goes on nice and snug on the back side of the stock. Snug on this side. What you're going to notice is the hole should line up very nicely on the bottom here. George is going to flip it over and we're going to reinstall these bolts. These should go in very easily. Remember, never force bolts. George is just finishing tightening these up. These you want snug. We put Loctite in every single bolt that we've put back into this bow. It's better to be safe than sorry. Next, George is going to install the Picatinny rail. Make sure you use Loctite on these. We're going to use blue Loctite on these. George is just tightening these bolts. We're getting close. After this, we'll put the pistol grip on and then the scope. And then it's out to the firing range. However, it's 15 below zero right now, so we might only take a shot or 2. But we really are excited to try this. You'll see George is just finishing tighten these up. Make sure they're snug. Obviously you don't want to strip them, so just use common sense. George is putting the pistol grip on now. After this, he'll put the end cap on, and then we'll finish up with the scope. At this point, I would say the trigger job has been successful up to this point. Soon we'll know when we hit the range. Now we've got the crossbow scope on here. We're almost ready to go. Here I am the next day after doing the Sniper 370 trigger mod. As you can see, I'm out in the cold weather. It's negative 15 degrees. I'm trying out the trigger mod that I just barely did last night on video. So far, very, very impressed. Just a matter of sighting it, the bow back in. I just also put on a level last night. Overall, I can say I think the trigger job was a success. I think it's undersold on the websites that people say it's good. Great, but I think it's excellent. I'm very, very happy, and hopefully you guys can find this video of implementing the trigger mod